Edmund, the princess. The thought of parting ways with his beloved rum and ale had crossed his mind, and he thought of how the mornings might feel if he was not riddled in dismay after a full night of drinking. Though he imagined nothing would come of it, for his reputation was not something that would leave him so fleetingly, and his guests would not simply forget his drunken performance. That dreaded night was perhaps his worst, not just for the horrid visitors or his father's persistence in being a cunt. It was how his brother looked at him, how Ollie looked at him. Those two gazes still haunted him like spirits in the night. Edmund stood in the great hall with his bow, drawing back his arrows before letting them fly ahead, striking the targets perfectly. Dawn was all he needed for the room to stay alight. The candles would surely be lit once the sky went black and the guests filled the hall once again. He dreaded the thought, as it swarmed him like the drums of war. Before his home was suffering the invasion of so many lords and their daughters, he would practice his archery in the yard, breathing in the open air on the castle grounds. Yet the presence of the dozens of young girls haunted him. He knew they would crowd around to watch his talents, each of them swooning at such a sight. The thought made him wish it were those exact girls standing ahead of him now, each frightened at the sight of him and his most cherished weapon. A few servant girls were watching, but there came no gawked mouths or widened eyes from their faces, for they had seen the same tedious show 1,000 times before, never once witnessing him miss a single shot. He recalled the days Raffers taught him the skills of archery, before the old man was truly old, at a time when the man's arms were strong enough to draw back the stubborn string of a bow. Landing his shots had a much different feeling back then. They felt crucial, more rewarding. To hit a target would send him running to retrieve his arrows with a spring in his step and a smile on his face, as well as the thought of knowing he was getting better, tending to the skills that would mold him into the best archer on the islands. Now he was the greatest, greater than Raffers ever was, greater than any man on Yark could dare to be, as well as those beyond his home's shores and across the mainland of Eskimar. They were stale now, more lifeless as they each landed. The perfection of his craft was now something he resented.
"I should have known you'd be hiding in the most obvious place in this castle, my lord," came the voice of Raffers. "All those steps I've climbed today, all unnecessary. If the gods are good, they'll spare me the acheful I've endured today."
Edmund turned to see the old man standing at the foot of the thrones, tired and breathless from his journey through the flint fort. "You should sit," Edmund insisted, pointing to the thrones. Raffers chuckled and shook his head.
"I'm afraid my rump is not as high-born as the ones those chairs yearn for, my lord. Those thrones are for salt spears."
"I won't tell. Take the small one. It's hardly a throne, and Sias will not want your head for it." The man fumbled for a moment before bowing, making his way to the pathetic chair before slumping down onto it, taking his many breaths and rubbing his brow.
"When the crown falls to you, boy, you ought to do something about the steep steps in this fort. Low Dawn has no such torture, and my chambers back home are much closer to the ground than they are in this place."
"Then they'll take first priority," Edmund joked, preparing another arrow that soon landed perfectly with the others. "I welcome your advice, Sir Raffers, more than any other man in my father's company, and I do wonder what wisdom you might give me regarding the princess."
"The princess?"
he asked.
"You speak of Princess Shasma?"
"Yes, after all, she is the only princess on these islands, at least from what I have heard. I do seek your counsel on a matter that's been brewing for some days now. I've avoided it as best as I can, but the Felian girl will not cease her efforts with my brother. I have no doubt the Queen is steering her every move, telling her what one might say to seduce their way into a proposal." Again, another well-struck arrow.
"Put the bow down, Edmund,"
Raffers told him, squinting his face at the sounds that came from his archery session, reaching out a gentle hand.
"Come up here and speak plainly with me."
Edmund nested the bow over his back, walking up the line of thrones before sitting on the biggest, plucking up the cup of rum he had waiting for him on the table.
"The Queen is seeking a proposal?"
Raffers asked him, intrigued as he fiddled with his scrolls. "Is that not why she and a dozen others sailed here?" Edmund said, feeling the warmth of his drink run down his throat.
"Those girls sailed here to pursue the promise of your company, to be courted by the heir to the Trident Islands. You say she wants a proposal from your brother, and not you." "That's right. Her Majesty was smart enough to know I would never stoop as low as taking the hand of a slave handler, and she wasted no time sinking her claws into Byron when she was granted the chance. I'm not entirely sure what game the woman is playing, but she's playing it well, and enjoying the sight of me struggling to retaliate."
Rufus stroked his thin beard.
"You've spoken to Byron about the matter?" "Not directly, not yet at least. It seems every time I find myself pursuing him, I find him linked in arms with that smirking bitch who's working whatever magic she has on him. She convinced him to step out beyond the walls of the fort after a single night in her company. She makes him smile, makes him laugh. The girl is doing something to him that my father chooses not to see." "The girl sounds as if she is good company."
Edmund shook his head.
"She's from Philia. She lives in a place built by slaves. She sits on a throne carried by slaves, and every jewel and ring on her body was mined out from the earth by slaves. If it were not for my father, I would never have allowed their kind into our shores, and I have every intention of sending them away when he finally dies. The gods need to quicken their pace with him. One can only imagine why they are hesitant to free us all from his reign."
Rufus's face fell slightly, as if all the woes he carried had swarmed him, turning his sullen eyes to the floor, hidden behind his great mane of white hair.
"I wish you wouldn't speak of your father like that, Edmund,"
he said grievously.
"The man loves you, as he loves your brother, and it pains me to know you do not pray or hurt for him during his numbered days. Your dear father is sharp-tongued and stern-minded, not a single soul would dispute that, but his brother Dallin was a far greater tyrant than he could ever bear to be, and your grandfather was no better. The lords of these islands' histories have set many scales. There are good lords and careless ones. There are the weak and the cruel, and your father casts far less fear in his shadows than many of the ancestors that came before him."
Edmund was silent for a time, trying to unearth any wisdom or counsel his scrollkeeper might have uttered as he spoke, yet nothing came of his search.
"You're wasting your breath if you truly believe you can convince me to sympathize with that prick,"
he spat.
"The man made my life miserable from the second he had my mother butchered and married a tech. He's threatened me more times than I care to recall. He's content with keeping Byron confined to the castle grounds at his side, and he cast my hand to a dozen ladies and called them all to Braille. You are welcome to whatever conceptions you have of my father, but do not speak to me of his love and his moralities, not when I sit here as his own son, his own witness to his cruelty."
The two held back their words as the silence wedged itself between them, clearing the air of the resentment Edmund had. Soon enough, he stood again, drinking whatever ale was left ahead of him before marching down the few steps.
"The only counsel I'd seek regarding my father right now would be of his burial plans," he said sternly. "And while he remains alive and more or less breathing, there is no need for these discussions. I will handle the matter of the princess myself. I will speak with the girl and let her tell me from her own lips what her intentions are with Byron. If she insists she wishes to offer her hand or seek his own, I will deny it on my brother's behalf, and these islands will have avoided a great threat." "And what great threat does the girl possess, my lord?"
Rufus questioned, struggling to his knees as he did.
"She has already sworn she will not have slaves within the shores of these islands, and taking her hand would mean a great army at our backs." "An army of slaves? I do not know what wars will come of my reign or what conflicts might emerge from the west, but I refuse to fight them with beaten men in shackles. We will find Byron a new bride, one from the mainland with numbers great enough to defend our house if war ever comes. Perhaps in a few years, Jane Crass might make a decent enough wife for him. The girl is heir to Mudmere. Father told me about the power the cross paths and their keeper will wield." "And as for your bride?"
Rufus asked him, squinting his scarred eye as he stared.
"The only reason my father wants me to wed is so I might continue this joke of a lineage,"
Edmund said as he slowly strode across the hall, watching as the servants carried his targets aside.
"Byron will play his part in producing the heirs my father so desperately desires, and when word gets out about the princess's interest in my brother, I'm sure he'll have a handful of noble girls seeking a proposal from him. As for Sias, my cousin will fuck anything that walks. It's no secret to these islands that both Morlin and Sirens Bay are crawling with 100 bastards born from the many whores he's bedded. When the day comes that my dear cousin takes the hand of a girl foolish enough to marry him, he'll cram her full of sons that will carry the name of Saltspear until her womb has run its course." "Edmund, you understand that being a lord comes with its duties," Rufus croaked. "It also comes with its power, such as the power to cast aside those that speak of my duties and my parts to play in this family's future. The truth is, I will have no part in it. I will simply sit on the throne and watch as these islands endure every summer and every storm. I will be the most honourable uncle to the children my brother brings into this world, and when I'm old and withering, like my father is as we speak, I will let the crown fall to Byron's firstborn son, and perhaps he will please his keepers in their council far better than I ever cared to."
Raffus seemed defeated. Edmund winced at the taste of quelling one of his most trusted friends, yet every lecture and every scrutiny of his aversions had brought his anger to a heavy boil. He yearned for their acceptance, for them to simply yield to his plans to never take a wife or bed the whores sent to his chambers. His father would soon be silenced, and his foul voice would cease to exist, never to punish Edmund with its relentless words again. His keepers would turn their attention to Byron. He was certain of it. At least once a marriage was brewing and their father was deep beneath the sea, rotting away from their memories. He left the great hall, fearing he might strain the treasured bond he had with the scroll-keeper if he remained any longer. Soon, Edmund found himself seeking out the princess. It was a task he never imagined himself doing. He was keen to avoid the Felian girl as best as he could, keeping clear of the paths she followed with a line of slaves at her back that carried her sour colours. The walls of his home did not seem the same as they once did, as if their new company in the fort had tainted every brick and every stone. He missed the eerie air, the days when it wasn't infected by the chatter and swoons of the noble girls that scurried around like cattle, each linked in the arms of their fathers and brothers. It had been days since the arrivals came from the west, and he had no shame in knowing he had not courted a single one of them. He had yet to converse with any of the girls for more than a fleeting moment, though the thought of being in any of their companies had made his stomach twist like a knot, for he knew they would speak only of their silly passions and their wishes to be a bride. On the advice of his keepers, he would no doubt have to promenade with the young girls. He would be forced to endure the torture of walking at their side, perhaps along the fort grounds, the grey beaches, or the battlements of his home. He thought of how he might be seen by Ollie as he painted Lord Sorin's portrait in the courtyard. He thought of the scorn that would start brewing in his lover's heart from such a sight. He walked through the long hallways, keeping his feet light as he did, knowing some of Brielle's guests would be lurking behind the doors. He feared the Queen might cross his path, or perhaps his foolish cousin. The journey felt like a march through an enemy's homeland, as if each step he took came with a chance of a brutal ambush. There were voices beyond the corners in the fort, ones that Edmund was quick to turn away from, slipping back into the shadows of his home that led him elsewhere. Later came the sounds of girls speaking with their handmaids, spreading their scandals and speaking of the negligent lord they crossed the sea to visit, only to be greeted by an endless absence. "I'm sure he's just overwhelmed, milady,"
one of the servant girls had said among the sounds of a bath with water splashing around in it.
"The poor man doesn't know where to start with all these girls around him. You have to be patient. He'll call on you soon enough."
He was quick to ignore them, unconcerned with their theories. With every flurry of footsteps came the thought of one of the ladies spotting him. He would soon be stuck in the presence of Rosalind Mead, Dana Mirren, or perhaps Lilith Drine. He wondered if the sounds of shoes against the stone could be one of the Polk sisters, or maybe Jane Crass with her foul-smelling father at her side, ready to trap him like a ship in a storm. Soon Edmund stepped out onto the battlements, shivering from the memories of his talk with the Queen as the wind struck them. He recalled the sight of his brother walking beyond the walls of the Flint Fort for the first time, smiling in the presence of Princess Shasma. The courtyard was barren, and there were no slaves in sight, not even among the shores he stared down at on the other side. There were a few figures bearing the colours of different houses on their cloaks or their dresses. He spotted Wendra Huck and her brother admiring the sharp shores, as well as those that bore crimson on their silks, flaunting the sigil of House Jace. There were guards, too, still on duty to keep guard of the passage that led through the hill to Edmund's chambers. It pained him to know Ollie was being kept from him. He knew he would be caught if he tried any other path to reach the sheets he wanted to share. He imagined the princess would not be a difficult soul to encounter, for the girl travelled with her flurry of slaves bearing her bright banners. She was no different than her mother, no less cruel and no less gifted in the art of seeming sweet to those who were gullible enough. Another thought came. He wondered if he could just simply summon Princess Shasma to his chambers,
Perhaps have Bree do a searching for him with the help of the other servant girls. He'd have them demand she meet with him, just by herself, to let her climb the 100 steps without the help of her obedient slaves that would no doubt carry her like lumber. And then they would have their discussions, free from the eyes of any other souls. No time had come for the two of them to talk, but Edmund was certain in his cautions of her. He had seen her convincing smile, as well as her hands as they trailed along his brother's shoulders, caressing him, along with whatever wicked whispers she spoke into his ear. The Felian guests were the closest things to witches he had ever known, and Saskara was renowned for those who dealt in such odious crafts. He searched the quieter paths of the Flint Fort, even the shrine garden where his ancestors were honored with graves and statues, each with vines and thorns flooding the stone. The princess remained hidden in whatever sanctuary she had from his curses. The thought of his brother had crossed him. He wondered if Byron might be in the company of her, perhaps among her many slaves, taunting him with her horrid customs that she brought across the sea with her from Felia. His heels turned. He headed for his brother's chambers, all the while thinking about what the princess might be uttering to him, working her charms and her spells to sway his virtuous mind. It turned his hands to fists and his jaw tighter, quickening his pace up the many steps that were now heavy, uncaring to those that might try to stop him for a talk regarding their courtships. He'd gladly strike them, sending them running to their fathers with cheeks that were swollen and red like beets. As the corner came, he charged around it, only to be met by the door of his brother's chambers that held only a single guard, one bearing the familiar colours of green and gold. The house of Kor in its rotten magenta was elsewhere, fouling the air in some other hallway and keeping Byron from its clutches.
"Milord,"
the guard said in a deep voice, bowing his head.
"Step aside. I must speak with my brother,"
Edmund told him, watching as the tall man shuffled out of his way before opening the door slightly.
"Your brother, milord,"
they called into the chambers, nodding as Edmund stepped inside before shutting the door behind him. Byron's chambers were smaller than his own, and the mounds of books made it seem even more so. Edmund could never grasp the idea of his brother reading so many books. He wondered if a mind could ever be capable of handling such a task. The glow of the rising sun trickled through the green drapes, turning the bricks of every wall to emeralds. The bed held the same colours, though the curtains were thicker and laced with golden ropes, as well as bearing the eel sigil among the silks. Most of the books held spines wielding the titles of the great tales of the South, each swarming with fantastical adventures and mythical creatures, ones Byron was so dearly intrigued with. Every day he would sit with his head buried in the stories of knights, kings, dragons, warriors, and sea monsters, never ceasing in his passions for them. Edmund caught sight of the books he brought back from his most recent voyage, the ones he acquired in Gale when his crew called for a visit to the taverns and brothels. They were the same kinds he yearned for, more books to add to his endless mountain of knowledge that would soon cave in around him. He imagined he'd already started reading them. Byron's mother's jewellery sat across a table in the corner, glimmering with blue gems. The House of Tech bore nothing more, not even a sigil, for their house was too small for such an entitlement, yet the colours lived on through Byron's cloaks that he was always keen to wear. "Hello, brother," came his brother's sweet voice, along with his smiling face as he emerged from the shadows of the corners. He looked different, only slightly, as if the fleeting kiss of the sun had done wonders for him and the pale face he often bore.
"You could build a whole new castle with this many books," Edmund joked, kicking some aside with his foot. "I ought to stop bringing them back for you from my voyages. They'll soon be spilling out beyond your door."
Byron smirked. "Sir Raph has told me one can never read too many books."
"And what's this new one you've got?" he asked, plucking a large book from his grasp and turning the title his way. "The Histories and Houses of the Bay of Embers," he said aloud, looking displeased as the words dripped from his tongue, eyeing the many sigils of the far northern houses, each known for their part in the trading of slaves.
"It's one of the biggest books I've ever seen, brother," Byron said with joy in his tone.
"Hardly the kind of book you'd usually ask for. Where did you get this?"
"Princess Shasma gave it to me." Edmund stood silent for a moment, pursing his lips as his eyes fell over the three-tailed scorpion. It sat among the five-horned buffalo of House Usoro and the viper of House Bakim.
Of course, he thought, almost admiring the princess and her strategies.
It's really interesting, Byron went on, taking the book back and leading him to the bed, where they sat together among the pelts. Have you read it?
Edmund couldn't remember the last time he had read a single book, yet the memories of Raffus breathing down his neck as a child was always with him, as well as every lesson of history and the policies of the crown. Books about the North are of no interest to me, brother, he told him, watching as Byron flicked through the yellow pages, gawking at the intricate drawings among the fancy writing.
Did you know that on the island of New Muru, the king sits on a throne made entirely out of teeth?
Byron said with a wincing face. Sounds like the king will have a sore arse if he sits too long. The two of them shed a subtle laugh. You went outside some days ago, Edmund continued. You looked as if you enjoyed it.
I was scared, he admitted, picking their nails at the thought. Princess Shasma wanted to see the shrine garden.
And that's all it took to convince you?
His brother leaned in close to share a whisper. I thought if I said no, the Queen would have had me executed.
Edmund shuffled closer to him. Brother, I have tried 100 times to take you beyond the walls of the Flint Fort, and you have refused me at every turn. What did this princess do to convince you to step outside?
He only shrugged.
He looked at his brother with suspicion, daring to ask if Princess Shasma had bewitched him in some way, perhaps cast some sort of spell on him to make him forget his fears. The idea sounded stupid to him as it crossed his mind. He even cursed at himself for it.
I used my time with her well, his brother continued. I told her all I could about you. I told her you're a really good captain, and you've had over 100 voyages. You fought countless pirates and travelled all over the south. She was really impressed, brother. I think I got her to like you well enough. She seemed interested in knowing more. You could tell her yourself.
Edmund shook his head, turning bitter from the thought. There's no use in speaking of me with a girl. I have no intention of offering my hand to her.
Which of the girls have you chosen, brother? Cousin Saya says you haven't courted any yet.
I haven't made a choice, but I'm certain the princess won't be the one I settle for. She is of the North. Their ways are far different from ours.
Byron went silent for a moment. Oh, he muttered. Rafa said she has the biggest army of any of the girls. He told me Philia would make the best allies for our islands if we ever go to war.
They were all slaves. Those were the soldiers fighting in the Queen's name. He had no wish to repeat the word. It had always turned his tongue to salt as it left him.
Did you see Uncle Cassian? Byron asked. He came from Gravis some days ago. He says he's here for the ceremony.
Edmund scoffed at the name. He will be waiting for some time before any vows are spoken. I imagine he's just here to test his luck with the ladies from the mainland.
He told me I should know how to swing a sword by now. He says he knew everything there was to know by the time he was 12.
I'm sure he thinks that makes him the most fierce man in Braille, but he forgets that I never opted for sword training. And you and I know I could have an arrow flying his way before he could pull his sword from its sheath. His curiosities for the princess and her whereabouts were still looming, though now they were thick in his mind, swatting away any other thought that came close. I'm looking for the princess, brother, he told him. I've looked as best as I could, but I can't manage to find her. I wondered if you might know where she is.
Byron's face turned from him. I'm not supposed to say.
Is she beyond the grounds? His brother shook his head. I have important things to discuss with her, and I'm reluctant to ask for her mother's assistance on the matter.
She said the Queen can't know, Byron whispered.
Brother, you will speak the truth to me, or I'll have every guard looking for her.
I'll tell you, you just can't tell the Queen. The princess is doing something secret, brother. You need to swear you won't tell the Queen.
I won't tell the bloody Queen. I'll stay well clear of her at every chance I get. She has no part in the things I must speak of with Princess Shasma.
Byron took a small breath. She's in the ruined halls.
It was no place for a princess, a place riddled in darkness and puddles among the stone that came from the fierce rain. Thank you, brother, Edmund said, stepping out from his chambers in pursuit, nearing the gloom. It was a passage that few souls would venture through, knowing the ground was crumbling and the cobbles were wounded enough to let light creep in from the outside. Even the torches remained unlit,
sitting along the ravaged walls without feeling the flames for over a century. It was the cruel work of the Bulgrins, in a life before his. As a child, he was told every tale of the war and how the Saltspear name lost its crown, how Brine Hall fell, and how his ancestors were butchered like feral hounds. The Flint fort survived the massacres, though it still held its scars. The sounds of a forgotten part of his home were soon disputed, divided with a noise of distant murmurs, once shared between two souls that spoke in hushed words from the darkness that Edmund followed. He kept his feet weightless, nearing the corner that held the whispers behind it, keeping them out of sight until he emerged, stepping out into the ray of sun that slipped through a large gash in the fractured wall. He saw the shadows of giant men, slaves with their spears at their sides, as well as the banners of House Core that he could hardly make out in the dim light. Their faces were just as much stone as the statues in the shrine garden, each unmoving and cold as he passed by them, eyeing the horrid markings all over their bodies. The quiet men lined his path, guiding the way for him through the dark without uttering a single word into the air. A young girl draped in a large dress that was every shade of pink was slumped on the floors, sitting beside a boy younger than her that bore no shirt, shoes, or good health. The princess and a slave, each with their heads looking down at a book they scribbled on, muttering to each other in their soft and foreign words. He didn't understand their tongues, though her voice came softly, unlike her mother's whenever she had spoken to a slave. Her hands were not at the boy's throat, and her eyes were not narrowed like a snake's.
"Princess Shasma," Edmund called out, urging himself to bow his head and straighten his back, turning into a fool as he did.
Her dark eyes beamed at him, as did the slave, who looked terrified by their new company. The two of them swiftly traded words before the boy, covered in markings, had hurried away, letting the darkness swallow him. "Good morning, my lord," she said, carrying the same tonality of her prominent mother, though that prominence was nowhere to be found. "I thought nobody would come this way."
"No, they often don't," Edmund said, watching her curiously as she held tight to the book in her arms, the one that she and the slave boy had been prodding at. "This part of the castle is too dangerous for you, princess."
"It is all so quiet here, and I needed a quiet place, somewhere I could not be seen."
"And you are aware that your chambers have a door you can close?" She smiled.
"Somewhere quieter than that." Edmund paused for some time, noticing how her composure crumbled slightly, decaying like a parched flower.
"I see. Might I ask what you were doing?"
She looked to her feet, then to the darkness that the boy had run into, until she turned back his way, biting her lip. "My mother cannot know."
"Your mother will not know, but I should like to, for these are my halls you're hiding in as you conduct your secret meetings with slave boys."
"I want you to swear it, please, Lord Edmund, to the gods you serve here in the south. She cannot know what I was doing here. She forbids me from teaching them." He scratched his head.
"I do swear it, though I don't serve the gods of this country, but I swear it all the same to you. I have no interest in pursuing your mother with any kind of blethering. Tell me, what is it you were teaching the boy?"
The princess gripped her book even harsher, doing her best to slow her breath. "Some of the slaves wish to read. Many were sent to the mines before they were 6 years old. They did not have time for it. If they learned to read, then they might work in Philia's archives instead, or for my mother's advisors. It is a better life than being beneath the ground of my home, Lord Edmund."
She was teaching the boy to read the words of her country. Edmund had hardly believed it, yet he had seen her at the boy's side, pointing out the foreign words of her home and not striking his skin like any other holder of a slave would. "You wish to teach them, and you wish to see that they live comfortably, yet you let them carry your throne on their shoulders and have them bring your cup to your mouth," Edmund scolded.
"In the company of my mother, yes," she told him. "But I do not hit them. I do not give them orders."
"No, I suppose you don't. But you are more than content to hold your tongue when you watch it happen in front of you."
"Lord Edmund, you and I believe the same things. To put a child in chains is wrong, and I swear to you that I will not let it follow me to your island. I have already told my mother that no slaves will remain in Braille once she is gone. They will go back to Philia and never return to my side or my service."
You would send them back to a life of labour, to serve your mother until they die, Edmund hissed.
My lord, your cousin speaks of his slaves on his island in his brothels, yet you have not stopped it. Sir Garland holds slaves on his island to fix the ships of your fleet, yet you still have not stopped it. Why?
I am not my father. I will have no say in it until the throne falls to me.
And I am not my mother. I would break the chains from every slave if I had the power to, but I am the 5th daughter of my house. You and I cannot change the things we want to see ended, because both of us are the children of those that keep them in our lives.
Edmund could not decide whether she gave a truth or an excuse of her lack in her intruding. He thought of how her words were the first he had heard from her, recalling that she was a complete stranger that wished for his brother's hand. He thought she would be simpler, no more than a foreign girl who would use the small words of his tongue, yet she stood her ground, unmoving to his staring eyes. It was his own mistake. He thought of the Queen's persistence, and how it ran through the girl's blood too. Her dark hair and gaze shined in the sparse light. She looked both solemn and scared, trying her best to convince him of her innocence among the barbarity of her home's customs. She presented herself as a girl born into a family she did not aspire to be like, lacking the cruelty they each wielded and flaunted throughout her days within the House of Kor. When the throne of the Trident Islands falls to me, the slaves on Morlin and Gronos will have no place in their labours, Edmund breathed. Sir Garland will be disbanded. He'll be cast to the sea for all that he is. As for my cousin, he is a salt spear, but as his lord, I'll be certain to restrain him from the horrors he prides himself on causing. There was another silence, a moment for the two of them to truly breathe and return to their stances.
Forgive me, my lord, the princess said. May I ask you a question?
Edmund nodded.
My mother tells me you have not courted any of your guests. Do you know which of them you plan to marry?
He sighed. Haven't the slightest idea, princess. It's a different story than yours, isn't it? You've already made your plans, thought out your schemes. You want to marry my little brother, take his name, and make your mother's wishes come true.
There are no schemes. Byron has a kind heart, and I would love him with all of mine. My mother and your father would be happy for the alliance we would form, and your islands would have the allies it desires, my lord.
You think it's so easy, don't you? Edmund mocked, stepping closer into the ray of light that divided them. You cross the sea, you find a young lad who's soft enough to sink your teeth into, and you play the sweet little part your mother told you to play until you finally have him under your spell. I've spent my entire life among men. I've seen every trick a whore has to lure them into their company, how they use their whispers and their pretty smiles to make them feel as if they yearn for it. Do you think I would ever let you trick my brother into believing you care for him or his home? Do you think I would be a lord stupid enough to open our shores to the likes of slave handlers?
No slaves will follow me, my lord, the girl croaked. And you forget that it was not Byron I came for when I first docked in Braille. I came to this island to marry you, and yet since the moment I met your brother, I have not once wished to be courted by the eldest son of Green Saltspear. I told my mother that I wanted him, and not you. I wanted the Saltspear that was kind to me, the one who was not drinking himself to death or shooting arrows at his own father. Byron is the one I love.
Edmund scoffed. You have known my brother for only mere days, Princess Shasma. Love is not what moves you forward in your efforts. It is your mother's hand and her desire for my ships.
Her eyes turned to pity as she stared into his. I would not expect you to understand what I speak of. My mother told me of your wishes to never marry, to rule these islands without a bride. What would you know of love if you have never wanted it?
He did know love. He knew far more about it than she did. Ollie was no wife, but he was the holder of all of Edmund's affections. The princess was a child who thought they knew so much, delusional to the true glory of how love really felt. My brother is kind, it's true, he muttered, and I would burn entire fleets to the ocean floor before I would ever let him be ruined by such a marriage.
I will not be the cause of that ruin, the princess told him. I swear it to you, Lord Edmund. I swear it to the gods of my home and of yours.
Swearing is one thing. I've seen men swear their loyalties to all kinds of things, to the gods, to their mother's health. Yet when they inevitably break their promises, no force strikes them down for their lies. They keep on breathing. He could still see the hope swimming in her dark eyes. It brought scorn to his. He resented her resilience. He imagined the girl had been given 100 different promises by her mother. He thought of how the Queen had undoubtedly told her she was destined to succeed in a marriage to a salt spear. It was no great shame. He even liked the idea of knowing he would be sending her away back to Philia with an unpromised hand. The Queen would fail, and he would smile at the sight of her ship shrinking into the distance. She would not topple. She was held up by her delusions and steadied by her faith. Edmund thought of no other ways to sway her, to make her crumble like the walls around them so he might pluck out any ambitions she had. The South isn't fond of the North, Princess. I'm certain that you're a smart enough girl to know that, he said slyly. Their smiles won't last once the feasts are done, once the gates of this fort are closed and my people return to their misery. Do you think they will still cheer for you, for the Philian princess who came to this island on the backs of their slaves? No, there is no man, woman, or child who could forget such a display. You would never survive on this island. You would be given no kindness, no love, and no prayers. The people beyond these walls would sooner wish to see your head on a pike before they ever see you as a salt spear. Your mother would be 1,000 miles across the sea. Your new guards would look the other way while the rats of this island call out for your death. Scaring her was an alternative of his. He watched as she faltered, shaking from his words. Your mother told me she married off your elder sisters, Edmund went on. She gave them to northern men, yes? That was a smarter path, keeping each of them far from the south, across the sea where they belong. It was a mistake bringing you down here. Everyone can see that. I have no interest in offering wisdom to those who I do not like, but for the sake of my brother and of the strain your presence causes me, I would tell you to leave these islands before dusk and never return, because you and I both know that you will never be welcome within these shores, not by me and not by my people. And if the day comes that they put your neck in a noose, I won't breathe a single word to stop them from hanging you from my home's walls. He left her breathless, standing in the dark as he turned away. Edmund listened to her silence, cherishing it as he returned to the walls that were lined with flaming torches, hopeful that the girl would heed his threats and be gone by morning.